expected findings. We're shifting now to another box in the qualitative research model process, which is data collection. So data collection just refers to collecting data to address your research question. So now you're going out in the field to collect data, and we'll talk about ways to ensure rigor and trustworthiness in this process as well. One way to build rigor in is to triangulate methods or use multiple sources to collect your data. For example, interviews, archival data, possibly focus groups, and so forth. In qualitative research, data collection should occur concurrently with data analysis. That is, rather than just collect all the data and then analyze it, you collect some and you analyze that. You collect more following leads in the data that you've already analyzed, you analyze that, and you repeat. Doing this helps readers and reviewers trust that you were truly responsive to the data. It's sort of like a bloodhound. You were following leads wherever the inquiry was taking you, and you were open to the data. Another way to build trustworthiness in your work, particularly when it's an observation or participation or an ethnographic type of research, is to make sure you spend sufficient time in the field. One of the best models for this type of qualitative research is Beth Bechke. Here is a short statement from her 2020 ASQ article on how actors negotiated the impact of technological change on the forensic science field. So Beth notes, I spent 3 to 6 months in each unit doing participant observation 3 days a week. I spent time with every analyst in each unit, many for multiple days, as well as every supervisor. As you can see, she's quite thorough in describing the actual time she spent in the field. She goes on to elaborate also what she did in those observations, but I pulled this example just to illustrate the point of the need to spend sufficient time in the field. When I was an associate editor at AMJ, I saw papers that varied widely in how much time was spent in the field. While I didn't come away with an actual number, I know it doesn't necessarily have to be 7 years, but certainly more than 70 minutes if you're really trying to understand the perspectives and the lived experiences of your informants. Another way qualitative researchers build trustworthiness into their accounts is to unabashedly describe purposively collecting data at a particular place where it's more likely they will see the phenomenon they are studying. This is called purposive sampling. As an example, in our 2009 paper on work-home boundaries in priests, we included this statement. To better observe the process of boundary work and its nuances, we studied a population that faces ongoing and particularly challenging boundary work, Episcopal parish priests. As you can see, we noted we wanted to study boundary work, particularly work-home boundaries at the time, so we found a sample that would allow us to do so and to see it vividly. By being transparent about this purposive sampling process, you build trust in the reviewers that you're disclosing your logic and truly trying to capture the phenomenon that you're studying. Another way to build rigor and trustworthiness into the data collection process is through theoretical sampling. So this is just sampling on the data. Recall I noted that data collection and data analysis should occur concurrently. So once you begin analyzing the data, inevitably you'll encounter something that's interesting that you'd like to follow up on. So you go back to the field, ask more questions, collect more data. Often authors mention this process to show the emergent nature of the qualitative inquiry. Here's an example from a paper by Jen Howard-Grenville and colleagues. Throughout this process, we return to the archives and to the field to gather additional data that could corroborate or elaborate our emerging lines of sight. So they mention returning to the archives and to the field for additional data to elaborate the theory that was developing in their analytic process. Again, this builds trust that the authors are truly trying to understand and evidence more fully the path that they're on or their emerging lines of sight. As another example, in an AMJ paper by Teresa Cartador and Mike Pratt, for which I had the pleasure of serving as associate editor, they too mentioned sampling on the data. Our discovery that credit union employees viewed who they were as bankers using terms similar to how police described their work led us to research on identity and identification. This in turn caused us to modify our interview protocol and gather new data. So in this case, a discovery led them to the literature, which then led them not only to collect new data, but also to modify the questions that they were asking. This transparency builds trust that they're doing all they can to understand and elaborate the theory that they're building. In this last slide, in this next slide, I'm going to talk about other ways that you can build in rigor in the data collection process. So one of them is through triangulation. And triangulation, was mentioned earlier, and that's just, ways to, different ways to get other sources to look at as you do your work. There are lots of ways to triangulate, but here's an example from the 2019 Sandhu and Kulik article. We conducted a total of 44 semi-structured interviews. We used extensive data secondary sources, including media interviews, benchmarking documents, brochures. 3 types of observations informed the data analysis. So the authors are showing all the ways that they collected data to show that they were assiduous in trying to wrap their arms around the phenomenon. One aside here, while I think it's important to triangulate sources, if you do, make sure you note how they were used. Don't just include them in the method section and then leave it at that. The authors actually did this, but in the interest of space, I didn't include the full description. Finally, the last tool for building rigor and trust into the data collection process is called multivocality. And so multivocality is just taking into account multiple varied voices as you collect the data. Here's an example from the paper by Rogers, Corley, and Ashforth, who studied respect in prison-based call centers. We focused mainly on new hires because their adjustment to the prison-based call centers likely offers the most salient experience of respect at work. To sample more experienced call center employees, we selected inmates whom we felt could provide the most information given their long tenure and experience in multiple call centers. In addition, we interviewed the quality control manager whose work spanned all call centers. And so, as you can see, they discussed talking with multiple people in the setting, which helps establish trust, that they rigorously considered multiple voices in trying to understand respect in this interesting setting. Moving on to the other mid-phase